the thing that shocked me after the writing of Stealing Fire a couple of years ago, which was all about peak states and how there's this kind of revolution of harnessing them, accessing them for greater insight, information, healing and collaboration. So far, so good. But in the couple of years since the book has come out, I've been shocked by seeing how many communities harnessing those things are just putting it straight in the ditch and buggering it up in all of the ways that have happened in the past with seemingly no awareness of the list of known issues and the disasters of the past.
So talking of the list of known issues, you've put together an ethical cult checklist.
Yeah.
Off the back of what you've been saying.
Yeah, well, what I realized was, basically this began, 20 years ago for me in graduate school, where I just was fascinated with millenarian and utopian communities and movements through the centuries. So 17th, 18th, 19th century, the Oneidas in New York, and then all the way to the 50s and 60s and the kind of booming of the boomer counterculture. Because as a Gen Xer, right, growing up in the aftermath of the Reagan-Thatcher years, right, it was a wasteland for progressive, transformational consciousness, culture, you name it, right? Very different landscape than now. And the only reference points we had were to go back to the beats in the late 50s, the counterculture of the 60s, and say, okay, this was the last place, this thread was before it went underground. So I felt it was a little bit like our generation was almost like, Zeppelin and the Beatles and and Pink Floyd and those guys with the British rock invasion, where they went and studied assiduously Robert Johnson and Mississippi Delta blues and Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and Chicago blues, and they fetishized it. Where American pop culture had kind of moved on and forgotten it all. And then the Brits were like, that is gold. Let's really go back and look at it and bring it back to life and reinterpret it. So we kind of had to, because it was just such a bleak landscape for our generation. My sense is what's happening with the millennial generation is that, and some of this is, just classic family dynamics kind of stuff, but there's nothing more boring or more, worthy of contempt than what your parents did when they were your age. And so my sense is that the offspring, not the boomers, but the echo boomers, the millennials, right, are a massive and rising generation, all sorts of cultural influences, but they are remarkably unaware of the lessons learned of the hippie generation and the counterculture. And so my sense is that, again, going back to the dynamics talked about in Stealing Fire, which was ecstasis, like peak experiences, they tend to go hand in glove with catharsis, deep healing and breakthroughs. And the moment you have that dialectic, stand up on the mountaintop, weep and be broken open, pick yourself back up again. Well, we don't do this in isolation, right? So we end up in communitas, right? Well, that's the social part. So it's the three-legged stool: ecstasis, catharsis, communitas. And whether that communitas becomes pre-rational cult, right, or post-rational emergent coherence is entirely up to us. And the bit that has been shocking me, beyond the weaponization and the troll stuff online, there's the actual communities of practice in the world right now that are repeating chapter and verse the most spectacular errors of the 60s and 70s. And so, if we pan back and just set the stage for a sec before jumping into the checklist, the idea that peak experiences and healing create tightly cohered, tightly bonded gatherings of people is sort of table stakes. That's been since Neolithic era, with drumming, chanting, gathering around the fire, singing our songs, grieving our dead, mating and praying, the whole bit, right? I mean, as long as we've been human, we have done these things together. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing. And if you really, etymologically, if you take the description of the word cult, cultus, it comes from Latin, and it just means to worship. So we've been doing that forever. And, scholars of religion look at mystery cults, right, back in the ages for the last thousands of years, and there's the cult of Eleusis in ancient Greece. There's the cult of Kali in India. There was the cult of Christ, before Emperor Constantine had his come to Jesus moment and made it a state-sanctioned religion. So a traditional cult, right, which was just a community of practice gathered around peak experience and healing together, right, is absolutely, completely pro-social, positive, part of the anthropological record, and a thing we do. And the directive there was you subjugated yourself, right? You dropped your separate identity to join with the lineage. There were those who have come before you for centuries, thousands of years, for time immemorial in many cases, right? You subjugate to that lineage. In the 60s, right, we got culty cults. We got those folks that said, subjugate yourself to me. I'm a Ronin. I am a samurai without a temple. I am a self-appointed God man or God woman. This is where we get Charles Manson. This is where we get Jim Jones. This is even where we get Adi Da, who is more challenging and problematic because he actually did also light people up. I think Manson, it's fair to say, was just a fucking psychopath, right? But Adi Da was a bent realizer, and those are problems. Osho too. Those are more sort of crazy wisdom magi with issues, where the other two were just whack nuts. But nonetheless, right, that's the general neck of the woods. And that's the trigger when we think of the word cult. So in some respects, I want to reclaim the term. And the next question is, what do we do now? Right? Because, we can't go back to ancient traditional stuff. Those lineages are all broken, and we wouldn't submit to that level of compliance. The culty cults speak for themselves and clearly don't want to repeat those experiments. But what is the realm for ethical cults? What is the realm for a place where you no longer subjugate the self at all? In fact, you actually valorize and support individual sovereignty, but at the same time create space for collective coherence. And that arguably is our project these days. How do we harness ecstasis, and healthy catharsis for vibrant, right, self-authoring, right, collectively cohered communitas? And so to the point about, and that's nice, and that seems interesting, and let's go do that, right? But to my point about, Churchill had that great quote, he who knows only his own generation remains forever a child. And I think we've got some decidedly childish efforts going on right now as people grab onto the lightning rods of peak experiences. And you can take the Burning Man community, the transformational community, the psychedelic renaissance, and the ayahuasca scene, and you name it. People playing with matches, right? And I always think of a little bit like that Disney film Fantasia, that classic, right? Where Mickey is the sorcerer's apprentice, right? And the magician, the actual mage, the one who knows magic, leaves. And Mickey's like, well, fucking hey, that looks good. I'm going to put on that pointy hat with the stars on it. I'm going to grab the wand, and I'm going to use magic to do all the dirty work I don't feel like doing. And then obviously hell to pay, right? Faustian bargain 101, just with a Disney Mickey ears attached. And so I think we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing a lot of false light. We're seeing a lot of people taking the claim that they're not actually ready for or conditioned for, and that in conjunction with not knowing the prior generations is creating a resurgence of bucket number 2, cultic tendencies. So now, yeah, we can for sure articulate perhaps a checklist for folks, because the idea is any communities of practice we're diving into, and I think you've got a list of some that you've been tracking and paying attention to, we are at risk of giving away our sovereignty in service of the power and the potency of some of these experiences. And as we give up our sovereignty, we often lose our discernment, our just common sense and judgment, and we can end up in places, that are not safe, not positive, wildly problematic, and can take years to recover from, if at all. So hopefully this is just a little bit, if we're taking a stand, right, for individual sovereignty, part of that is cognitive literacy. I actually understand what's going on en route to cognitive liberty. Therefore, no one can claim space between my ears without my consent. And so hopefully this checklist is just a little bit of an inoculation that folks can use. And the idea here is like, hey, we can't mandate any of this shit, right? I mean, particularly the nature of peak experiences are that they are fundamentally antinomian, right? They do not subject to hierarchical tops-down control. And that is both their greatest promise and the greatest challenge, because the greatest promise is, hey, this is how we subvert the dominant paradigm. Yay. The other, but the narcissistic, reactionary one is, you're not the boss of me, right? And so how do we strike that balance? So my sense is that ideally we would have a code of conduct for ethical culture, right? And it's obviously opt-in and elective, but so's the UN, right? And it could be that idea of saying, hey, if you want to follow these best practices, and this is just a rough first draft. I mean, who knows? We can come up with 1,000 others and they will iterate over time. But let's just use this as a test case and say, hey, like the UN, you can opt not to be in the UN. You can be North Korea or Iran. If you want to be in the UN, you agree to free and fair elections. You agree to open markets. You agree to civil liberties and the protection of humanitarian rights, the Geneva Convention, etc. And in exchange, you get access to all of our data, all of our research, the IMF and the World Bank, right? The League of Nations notion. You get access to all the network effects of being in good standing. And another option would be sort of, Standard & Poor's or Moody's ratings for companies. You can do whatever the hell you want as a CEO, as WeWork has just been exploring. But you will run the risk of having your bond rating downgraded from AAA to junk. And it's not that junk means you don't get to play. You still have a right to exist. But it just means that only the foolhardy or the incredibly savvy / cynical investor will opt to play. So there is a signal in the marketplace, and in this case, the marketplace of ideas, the marketplace of culture, that lets other folks know approximately what they're getting into, right? So that said, some of the options, I mean, this was just 20 years of research academically, seeing the patterns and seeing the premises, and then also noticing what gave me the willies, basically, and trying, watching certain communities. And they break down into three things, which is, here's the culty cult checklist. Like, this is the things not to do. And if you are finding yourself in a community where a lot of these flags or alarm bells are going off, just an encouragement, slow your roll, think twice, seek outside opinion, check your gut, check your heart, and know you're not crazy. And in a reality distortion field, hopefully this is a sort of a clearer signal you can perhaps index off. I think that's probably a mixed metaphor, but there we go. So the first one, I'll lay out the three, and then we can unpack them in detail. There's three subsets to each. So the first one is, does the leader grab the one ring of power? And this is probably the most central and non-negotiable one. So if we use, the Lord of the Rings as the example, and obviously the One Ring is the one that the hobbits carry and the Gollum had. It is incredibly potent. It conveys godlike power, and the whole story. I mean, the brilliance of Tolkien is the depth and layers to how he lays that wrestling with power and virtue and evil, and Boromir is one of the men. I mean, Aragorn is the only uncorruptible man, right? Boromir is there, but he wanted to be king. He has aspirations. And there's that great scene where they're climbing up the snow-capped peak, and Frodo drops the ring. And Boromir picks it up. And as he picks it up, and he's going to give it back to Frodo, but he kind of hesitates, and he starts hearing the ring rates, and it sort of all gets freaky-deaky. And you can see, and he's struggling with but I could do so much good with this. Right, and he is being bent towards grabbing the ring. The same happens with Saruman. Saruman the White, right? Originally the baddest ass and more potent than Gandalf. But Saruman is eventually like, this is inevitable. Look how much we can do. Bond together with me. We can change the world. So even as he is being bent by power, he is still aspirationally ascribing to virtue. And I think it's Gandalf. I don't remember whether this is Gandalf or Dumbledore, but one of those guys has to say that no dark wizard did not begin seeking truth. And I think that's a really critical one to note, because it's easy to dismiss culty cults and the gurus with feet of clay as charlatans. They were pretenders, they were fake. So when inevitably it goes off the rails, everyone's like, ah ha ha, see, we told you so. The whole thing was a sham. And I think that's a really flattened, not very nuanced interpretation. And if you take Adi-Da and Osho, I mean, many people are familiar, probably most familiar these days because of that Netflix documentary, Wild Wild Country, with Osho, which actually weirdly didn't go into him much at all. I was frustrated by the lack of insight into him and his actual teachings versus the scandals of the commune and that kind of thing. But for those that don't know Adi-Da, he was arguably one of the most potent realizers of that era, particularly of the kind of 70s, and left a lineage of, I mean, many bright lights in the, more recent, spirituality space touched him at some point. And you can't dismiss those guys as easily. They were prodigious talents, and they had absolutely non-ordinary skills and the ability to shift state in themselves and others and create potency. So it's not enough to dismiss them. The question is did they at some point grab the One Ring?
What does that mean to grab the One Ring?
What it means, I think, is basically there's a Jungian psychologist, brilliant guy named Robert Johnson, and he has a great phrase for this, which is our golden shadows, right? And the idea of, it's not just our shadowy shadows, the dark stuff we disown and can't fess up to. There's our golden shadow as well, which is I can't be that great, but Tony Robbins can. Right? I can't be that great, but Brad Pitt, or Kylie Jenner, right? Have the capabilities, have the virtues, the things I value, but not me. And quite often, when we end up with charismatic gurus, they will light people up on stage or wherever they are, and people will puke. I mean, this seems to be a reflex of tribal primates, right? We will puke our golden shadow onto the human who connects the circuit and lights us up. It's like little ducklings getting imprinted by the first face they see, right? And if you bring people into high self, true self, the first face they see is often the sage on the stage. Now, grabbing the One Ring is the equivalent of accepting that gold, right? Of saying, I am strong enough to hold it. Yes, I deserve it. I am that. And no matter how tempting that is, it's only a matter of time before that gold will drop that person to their knees. And there is a dynamic where, what you could call sort of the Lucifer principle, right? Where, and this goes back to prodigious talent. How is it that so many totally gifted teachers actually end up going to the dark side? And it can be that if, you can be 99% translucent, radiant. And if you've got 1% shadow still left, you're now shining so brightly, right? That the Lucifer principle kicks in, which is, dare thee to look upon me and spot my imperfection. I am radiant, I am dazzling, and you, mere human, bowed, cowed, cannot see my humanity or my fallibility anymore. And as a result, right, now I'm pulling all kinds of juice. I'm engaged in psychosexual, spiritual technologies, whatever I'm doing to juice this high, and now that metastasizes. So I could be 99% done on the way to God consciousness, and that 1% speck can and I can suddenly become a Sith Lord. And there have been researches on, fMRIs on power these days, and power literally corrupting. I mean, Lord Acton 101, right? Absolute power corrupting absolutely. And in the psycho-spiritual tantric spaces that many of these folks are playing with, it can do that in overdrive. And so you can have somebody who is absolutely love, light, goodness. And many of the stories start out for the first years and decades even of just, it's sunshine and rainbows, man. This is the next evolution of humanity, and then bends. And I think that's potentially some of the darkness. So the advocacy is either don't grab the ring, have the fellowship, and/or as opposed to the Luciferian principle, the grabbing and the claim, is to embody the more Christic archetype, which is my humanity is connected to my divinity. They are not separable. And it is the combination of those two that leads to something really durable and worthwhile. So the next one is the idea of creating in and out groups. So anytime there is a separation of who we are versus the rest, that is massively problematic. And the third is the weaponizing of peak experiences and healing. So we can kind of go back and kind of unpack these one by one.
Yeah, because you've got some really good, solid examples within all of these kind of headings.
Yeah. So just to kind of go back. I mean, the first one is there's a lot of meat on that bone, so it's kind of worth it. One of the first things to notice is in the grabbing of the One Ring, we talked about the accepting of kind of the golden shadow of the followers versus constantly giving it back, saying, no, you are that too, right? Own it. Don't give it to me. Don't give it away. Right? Hold it and live into that. Right? The first one, which is a dead giveaway, is a mythologized origin story of the founder. This is either prodigious birth, early childhood, signs of talent, whatever it is that they are somehow have been set apart from way back when for greatness. It can also, another variation is the profound conversion experience. And this has become a trope in info marketing. I was making tons of money, I was doing such and such, and then a car accident, or then something, and I woke up in my hospital bed and I realized, now my mission in life is to sell shit to other people, right? That is the current perversion of it, but it exists, the ancient, ancient is the, Saul on the road to Damascus. Right, I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. I was a heroin junkie, crackhead dealer, and now I'm here to bring you the good news, whatever that is, right? So there's some highly stylized, mythologized origin story that sets that person apart as if they were marked for destiny and greatness. The next is absolutist claims of attainment. So I am 100% awake, enlightened, fill in the blank, whatever their descriptive categories are. And the key there, and this is, that Lucifer principle was another articulation of this. If that's true, then everything that happens in relationship to me is now no longer mutual or intersubjective. Because I'm perfect, and this is an absolute attainment, it happened back when, it's usually rolled into my mythologized origin story, I am not subject to human critique. So if you've got a problem with me, right, that must be your shadow. It must be your projection. It's your shit, not mine. I've got no shit. Or, and this is the final one, because it's like, no, wait a second, what you did, you chucked somebody into a fire. I mean, I had a Terry Patton actually describe this. He said, Adida chucked me into a bonfire in a fit of seeming rage, but it woke me the fuck up. And I'm forever grateful. And you're like, dear God, right? You look at that from Health and Human Services, or any other kind of grounded perspective, you're like, that is abuse. But within that frame, and even within his interior experience, shit worked, right? So you have this claim of, I'm not subject to some intersubjective critique. I'm no longer human in the way you're human. Everything that you're experiencing is your shadow and projections. Or, this is crazy wisdom. I might be acting batshit, I'll grant you that, but I'm doing it for your liberation. And that leaves people absolutely gone and rudderless from any kind of recalibration and any kind of mutuality. And then the final one, which often comes, especially when people adopt Eastern habits and customs and hierarchies, is ritualized separation. Ritualized separation of the leader, the founder, whatever that person is, from the rest. And that can lead to, and that will show up as things like satsang, which is basically translated as sitting, experiencing the grace of the master, which is totally fucked in a Western context, right? But people will use that all the time. Or there's a difference in robes and dress. If you've ever seen somebody who looks like they're at Burning Man on a Wednesday, wearing bindis and white flowing robes and shit like that, all of those kind of things. Any kind of name change, self-appointed, and obviously my name is now super Ananda something or other, and I am bliss and holy, holy all coming things. Those descriptions are all clumsy efforts of separation and exceptionalism. And it can even happen in a sort of secular sense. It can happen with handlers. It can happen with green rooms. It can happen with, you only have contact with me when I'm on stage, and otherwise I disappear and I get whisked off and there's protection around me. Or if you really want personal contact, you got to sign up for my super duper platinum, $100,000 a year special package, right? So any of those, it can be secular. It is often, in its least imaginative versions, apes more esoteric and lineage traditions, but any of that kind of separation. And so those are really things to look out for, which is if you hear a overly polished, mythologized origin story, if you experience them explicitly stating or even implying or allowing others to name them as fully and explicitly and irreducibly awake or attained or something, big flags. And if you see any of the signs and signifiers, the trapping, the costuming, the structuring of the ritualized and tightly constrained presentations to community, all big flags, all big flags. So the next one is the in-groups. and versus outgroups. Now, this one is tricky because there are lots of communities that really do feel like they've got a world-saving purpose. That's a big part of, purpose. I mean, Silicon Valley's great joke on the HBO show was every single pitch at TechCrunch ended with, "And we're going to make the world a better place," which might have flown 5 years ago, not so much now. But in-groups and out-groups and messianic sense of purpose. Messianic purpose is often used to suppress my individual needs. So particularly, the simplest example is volunteer labor, right? Oh, you must not care about saving all the whales, or you must not care about saving the earth if you're not willing to work for nothing, work for cheap, et cetera, crazy long hours, lousy conditions, because if we're always holding up this amazingly, overwhelmingly higher purpose, then your petty needs are just that. And so there's often a suppression of where we are, right? And it often supports neglecting other base level needs. It could be relationships, children, economic stability, 1,000 work-life balance, 1,000 things, because this is always so much nobler. And I can't critique that noble purpose, so I have to suppress my own experiences. The next would be specialized language. The more you end up, and every community from the army, to business consulting has acronyms, has shorthand. It's a way we compress information to use it quickly. But when you have abstract, non-falsifiable, pseudo-spiritual terms, either using esoteric terms, particularly again defaulting to Eastern traditions quite often, or pseudoscientific terms. This is the quantum field. This is our pineal gland, or mixed total jumbles. I'm entering the Akashic field via quantum theory and my pineal gland and my theta waves. You see people mixing and matching shoddy neuroscience with poorly understood lineage traditions with New Age concepts into this jumbled gobbledygook that nobody, family members, colleagues, former family, partners, understands what the fuck you're talking about. And that creates a further separation between you and the rest of the world. And, and then finally, some sense of that this is we are on the verge or the edge of something brand new. There is nothing that has come before us that is quite the same as this. We're unique and distinct, and also therefore not subject to the calibration or the dampening or critiques of past precedents. Yes, they all did that, thought that, said these things, did these things. We, however, are the blank slate, the true tabula rasa, and as a result, we don't have. There are no governors. There are no governors. We are literally writing our own story forward. And then the final one is just the idea of the weaponizing peak experience and healing. And the first is quite often these communities grow together via tightly controlled access to those peak experiences. So someone might, they're looky-loo, they get recruited, they get invited, they drop by. They have some amazing state-changing, state-shifting experience. It could be breath work, it could be radical encounter, group dialogue, it could be a tantric psychosexual experience, it could be a psychedelic experience, you name it. They have something that literally blows their mind. But you only get access to that thing, to that experience, via the leader when they choose. Right? And they get to shape the meaning making around it. And typically, side efforts are strongly discouraged. And if they are, and either they, if they are tolerated, they're usually the meaning making, what's going on is very scripted, like you two go off and shag, or you guys go and have that psychedelic experience so you can go and access the world we've described, right? But iconoclastic, heretical experiences are like, well, we went and conducted that experiment, got totally different results. And here's what I think now, that will get shut down in a hurry. And the next step on deconditioning, because obviously peak experiences and profound healing experiences erode our boundaries, right? And typically these communities massively overprivilege emotional catharsis versus cognition and discernment. Now, part of that is natural. There's a healthy counterbalance to our hyper-cognitive, hyper-linguistic, neurotic, constantly self-aware, default mode network, agitated monkey mind, modern selves. Got it, right? And most of us are super disembodied and not enough in our hearts and all those kind of things. So there is a absolutely legit corrective argument. But when it's pillar to post, When they say don't think, or you're thinking again, that's bad, you've got to get back down in your heart and feel that's good. When there's a complete vilification of logic, reason, discernment, right, that becomes massively problematic. And then that sets us up for the final whammy of them all, which is key decisions and commitments, whether that is emotional, testimonies, sharing, disclosing information, vulnerable, compromising information, whether that's allegiance to the group, whether that's atonement for transgressions, whether that's financial and commitments. I'm signing over my entire trust fund. I don't know how I got here. I just happen to be a rudderless rich kid. My gosh, they love me so much. And now I've just had this boundary dissolving experience and I capitulate because the truth of the experience I'm having, that cathartic, ecstatic breakthrough, breakdown, whatever it might be, they now couple to all those other truth claims. See, this proves that we are special and different. This proves that our master or teacher is attained. This validates and vindicates everything else we've been saying at a time when your boundaries are completely permeable. You have no judgment of your own, and we are deliberately moving you and manipulating you. And this, by the way, does not require overt cults. This is chapter and verse info marketing 101. Let's blow the smoke cannons. Let's get everybody up there weepily saying how much this thing has changed their life. And oh, wouldn't you know it, we're going to upsell the shit out of you on our premium program right fucking now. So we see these psychotechnologies deployed across the spectrum. And just a couple of things to point out. One is false positives and false negatives. So the false positives, if you go through this checklist, you're like, well, wait a second. I mean, I kind of think maybe my community does some of those, especially the world-saving purpose and specialized language, you know, and even the idea of kind of in-groups and out-groups. Like, we are a crack team. We're doing a hard thing. So you might go through this list and see false positives for an otherwise healthy organization or community. And the only way to check is just see how many of the other flags, especially the one ring of power, and especially the manipulating people in suggestible states and conflating truth, power, sovereignty, authority with the vulnerability and pliability of people in those states. And the other is the false, I said false positives. The other is the false negatives. You can come around many of these communities, especially in the earlier years, and it's shiny, happy people. It's going off. It's the best fucking party you've ever seen. People are filled with love. They're hugging, they're playing, they're joyful. So in the by their fruits ye shall know them. And you look and you're like, man, this is an abundant garden. This looks amazing, right? It's because of their use and abuse of these super powerful psychotechnologies, not in spite of them, that they're getting that early liftoff. So the key there is to really understand, again, discernment, caveat emptor. We really have to pay attention. We really have to play the long game. And we really have to triangulate between these different touch points to make informed and empowered decisions about not only who we follow, but if we are in a position of leadership ourselves, what kind of communities do we create? And can we see the known issues? Can we see the potholes and the train wrecks and the skid marks where those who have come before us have gone off the road? And can we steer a straighter path to get more of us to our collective destination?
Recently, Jamie led a workshop with Rebel Wisdom in London called Ethical Cult Building, Collective Sense-Making in an Age of Existential Risk. To see the films from the workshop, become a Rebel Wisdom member.
Rebel Wisdom is a new sense-making platform, bringing together the most rebellious and inspiring thinkers from around the world. If you're enjoying our content, then you can help us make more by becoming a subscriber, which will give you access to a load of exclusive films. Also, you can then join our group Zoom calls to discuss the ideas in the films, and you can send us ideas for questions for upcoming interviews. We're also looking for talented people to help us out with editing, graphics, music, that kind of thing. And if you're a regular viewer, you'll know we talk a lot about the value of embodying or actually living out the ideas that we talk about. So that's why we run regular events in London. Check out the links on the website for more. And hope to see you soon.